What is up, everyone? Welcome to the Great American Film Off.
Hello,
I don't
all.
know why the background's not there. There it is. There's our
Oh,
popcorn. There's our
we were
our
we were at a
boxing
loss
ring.
for popcorn for a moment. It's
We
very
were in a
scary.
vast array of black space, of dark space. How are you doing, Krosby?
I'm doing pretty good, Dill. How about yourself?
Doing well. Can't complain. We're talking about superheroes today, so that's always exciting.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. Oh,
Yeah, and it's nice because I do a Marvel podcast about the.
that's
It's all been
right.
MCU centered. That I don't get a chance to talk about the older stuff. We don't
Yeah,
get to
you're
talk
an
about the
expert. This
pre-MCU and
is this is
yeah,
very exciting.
well, yeah, it's just nice to talk about movies that I don't talk about on the podcast because we're not covering. Also, there's some DC movies on the board too for this episode too. So
Exactly, which
yeah,
is interesting.
yeah,
You know, I think the thing that's interesting about this category more than any other category we've talked about. I mean, true, the DreamWorks stuff was definitely a part of our childhood, but with this, it's something that sort of as a genre came of age when we were getting older.
right,
And when I say older, I mean into our later teens and young adulthood. But I think it's interesting because with something like this, I think you can actually be a bit more objective than with things that are just completely drowned in nostalgia, which
right,
I think is fun. But of course, with my
right.
with my pick, I still wound up coating myself in
Me
nostalgia
too.
thoroughly.
Me too. Me too. I mean, that's part of what makes debates fun is you got to bring yourself to the table, and what better movies to represent you than something that is nostalgic, that is personal. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you saw on the title, if you're watching this video and you're listening to it, that the topic of today is what is the best pre-MCU superhero movie. So
Oh,
basically, how the show works, we set that topic. Crosby and I said it last a few weeks ago,
we
and
did.
then we go through 5 different rubric points, determining who will get a point for each round. First to 3 points wins the film off for that week. We are tied 1-1. I won the first film off, and then Crosby won the last one. So
Pretty
I will be
exciting.
going. I'll be going first because I lost the last one.
Exactly.
I'm getting the handicap this time, as you might say. Yeah.
Definitely.
So Crosby, why don't you break us down this rubric that we are exploring today?
Okay, so we thought that it was important to, refine our rubric specifically for such a specific genre. So with the first point, we have the scale of effective villainy. This is so important with superhero films because the villains almost always supply the arc, and the
Hmm.
heroes react to it. So if your villain doesn't have an arc that's either believable or genuinely frightening, then you find yourself drifting from the film.
Right.
2 is our Green Screen Fight Club, which is a name I'm very proud
Yes,
of.
I was a very big fan when Crosby pitched the name.
Yeah, and this is just, I do think it requires a certain something of an actor. You've got to remember that, like, for us, we're watching these really heroic, exciting battles, but for them, a lot of the time, they're either, they're fighting a green ball on a stick. You know what I mean? They're fighting just in front of this curtain or something like that. So I do think that, especially for superhero movies, it's a certain kind of action movie that I think asks it. For our third point, we have the Elite Editing Award. I mean, look, so much of superhero films, the special effects, the costumes, the props,
Yeah.
it's it's an incredibly important category for regular films, but for a superhero film or a sci-fi film, my God, it's an enormous part of the experience.
Definitely, like everything that you get footage wise, if you put that directly on the screen, no one would go see it. It's all about what happens.
Exactly.
It's all about how the costumes, like you said, how they're dressed, how the sound they use, like what sound effects do they make, like the visual effects themselves. Like there are full
Exactly.
MCU movies, like you said, that are filmed on green screen where the ground they're walking on is not even ground; it's
It's
just
not even
green.
ground.
Yeah,
Imagine. It's
crazy.
insane. But for our fourth award, we have the GDP, the genuine directing points. I think we can all agree that there are certain films which hold a special place in our heart in the canon of pop culture that aren't necessarily very good as films. We all have them. It's okay. But with this point, what we want to do is we want to genuinely examine the film that we are each bringing and sort of say, okay, what is it that was brought to this film that made it good in an
Right.
objective sense, not necessarily in an emotional one.
Good. Yep.
So that's for our GDP. And then, of course, to close it out, as always, Netflix
This is our
checking
constant.
scale.
Our constant. Yeah. How rewatchable is it? That's the question.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
before we start, Dylan, I would say that is probably one of the things that Marvel is best at, is the fact
Mhm.
that they make movies that are very, very watchable. And I think the thing that can be almost a trap with the Marvel movies is that you start into them, and because of how much they revolve around events that have happened in movies previous to them or setting up movies after them, you are almost compelled to keep watching the movies,
Right.
particularly now that there's Disney Plus, where all these Marvel movies are in the same place. What a dangerous invention,
I know.
Dylan.
Yeah, streaming's definitely changing the way we watch everything.
Absolutely.
And I think it's important because a lot of these movies, especially like the early ones, like you have like I don't know if you picked any of these, but like Superman and Batman, these are
Oh
movies
yeah.
that came out once in a blue moon, and like there were not like 3 or 4 of them coming out a year, so a lot of those
No.
movies older generations rewatched them so much because it was all that was available. You didn't have MCU where it's like I'm going to turn on my Disney Plus and go pick between 25 movies. No, it's
Exactly.
you had do you want to watch Superman, do you want to watch Batman, or do you want to watch the Batman television series or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So it's very interesting to see like how superhero movies in general have grown, both MCU, DC, everything, and
Agreed.
how
It's
accessible it
fascinating.
is. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, without further ado,
All right, Jill, you start us off
I
now.
know I might break your heart because I know Crosby and I obviously we're the same age. We have the same similar nostalgia.
We do.
I did promise I would not take animated movies, so one of my top picks I immediately left off the board because I've argued animated movies two weeks in a row.
It's true.
So there's a super family that I will be leaving off. That would have been my like backup if I had to have a backup. But my movie that I picked, and this is not the one that comes to mind a lot when people are talking about this specific franchise and this trilogy.
Yeah.
But the Spider-Man trilogy is my favorite trilogy,
Okay.
maybe of all time, definitely superhero wise. And
Yeah.
I did go with not Spider-Man 2, which is the most popular choice, but I went with Spider-Man 1, which is from
Ooh.
2002. Sam Raimi directed it. Yeah, it's the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. For some reason, that is the movie that I would like to argue for this topic. It is the one that has stuck with me since my childhood. I rewatch it every year. It is my favorite. So Crosby, I hope I didn't steal your choice. I hope your choice is still on the table. Let me know.
You actually didn't steal my choice.
Okay,
but
I'm very glad. I was heartbroken.
I'm glad
that
too.
I
My heart has settled. But I really like that pick. I think it's really interesting because it's very much a genre beginner in a way. You know what I mean? Like I would say that the Raimi Spider-Man films sort of taught us a lot about how a superhero movie should be constructed and how to make these things that honestly had started to feel like tropes in like the Superman and the Batman universe.
Yeah.
Taking those orphaned children and those special powers, et cetera, and making them really, really fresh and really interesting. And speaking of orphans with powers,
oh boy,
I went with a film that I've loved for years and was actually one of the very first superhero movies I ever saw, X2.
Wow,
the second
nice.
X-Men film.
I'll admit, Crosby, it's been a while since I've seen this, so you're gonna have to do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of facts.
No
but
worries.
it's your movie you picked, so I'm very happy to be talking about that. That's awesome.
Yes.
I was just thinking I was trolling around X-Men movies, but like the X-Men movies that I go to more are the ones that are post MCU.
Totally,
like
yeah.
Your Logan and Days of Future Past, but I love that pick. X2 is a great pick. So we will be fighting Spider-Man 2002 versus X2. Do you know what year that came out? Let me just.
X2. Really? Yeah, I got it right here. This came out in 2003. So we had 2002 and 2003.
We're going down to our diaper ages a little bit later. But yeah, this is the I think that resurgence, like you said, of a new genre of superhero movies. This is not your like once in every 5-10 years type superhero blockbuster where it's like it's a superhero movie, but it's a movie like it's not its own genre yet until these movies started popping up. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the villains. So Spider-Man, you got Green Goblin. And this is partially why the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie trilogy works as well as it does, is because the Green Goblin, and then later you have Doc Ock, and then you have Sandman in the other movies.
True,
But the
totally.
villains are so good because they establish this idea of the villain being someone completely different to the hero himself. You know, in Superman, it's Lex Luthor is Lex Luthor, no matter
Yeah.
what angle you look at him. You know, Batman, the Joker is the Joker, but here it's Green Goblin and Norman Osborn. You have two completely separate characters, and the Norman Osborn is a way for the audience to kind of almost relate or empathize with this character to a
Yeah.
degree, because he is almost this, not father figure for Peter, but you know,
No,
he
but
does
yeah.
take Peter under his wing in a sense, because he admires Peter. You know, at the graduation, he's, you know, impressed with the science award, and he, you know, he cares about Peter to an extent.
Right.
So
yeah.
when it turns out he's the Green Goblin, it's like something we see in MCU a lot now, is like the whole villain reveal of, oh,
Totally.
I trusted you, but now when you put on the costume, I can't trust you. I have to fight you. It's the same thing we see with Spider-Man Homecoming.
Absolutely.
But I think this was one of the first to really establish that trope. And again, like, these are tropes now, but back then this was not a trope. You know, this was the trendsetter.
Yeah. I think that's something that's really interesting. I have to ask you, did you occasionally feel when you're watching your movies, no matter how much you love it, in this pre-MCU world, I can't help but feel that when you're watching a superhero movie, there are points where they're just kind of feeling around, where they're like, what the fuck do we do now? Like, we've figured out, like, this part works. You know what I mean? Like, we know that doing this in a superhero movie works. So we're going to try to figure out an interesting way to do that. But we're also just kind of winging it, you know? And I love that about these movies. And I think it's something that, while the MCU is amazing, while they've done a lot of incredible things, something we'll never have access to again, because now there is a specific way that you make superhero films, unless your film is sort of flying in the face of that, a la Thor Ragnarok, or, you know, something like that. For my villain, you have Stryker, as played by the great Brian Cox. Really, I think a really effective villain, one where you see him sort of neutralize Professor X, which from a storytelling standpoint, I think is just very smart, because it makes him seem almost unimaginably powerful. Because in the last movie, you've been watching Professor X do basically whatever he wants. Like, if there's something going really wrong, Professor X can probably fix it. When you see a character just mess up your hero in that way, it's like watching, of course, I feel like I'm going to just be bringing up Marvel examples this whole time, but it's like watching Thanos punch Hulk at the beginning of Infinity War. It makes you worried because it changes the battlefield in a way you weren't expecting.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because you know, these are characters that have come from comic books too, so there's also a certain expectation of like how they're adapted to the screen. I think Green Goblin's interesting because I think in the comics it's a creature, but here you have him wearing this armor, this almost suit, and it's another example of that, like, you know, the science is the power. It's not, you're not, I mean, Spider-Man himself, you know, Peter is bitten by a spider, but Green Goblin, I mean, he does have that stuff infused in him that makes him bulk and buff.
Right.
But it's the glider, it's the prop that does all the fighting. It's not necessarily him and his own strength. He doesn't have superpowers. I mean, obviously he does, but he doesn't use those superpowers the way we think of a
conventional supervillain using them.
Right. And I think that's honestly even scarier, because now it's not just an element of, oh, this guy's naturally powerful. It's, oh, he has power in the brawn, but also he has the power in the brains to make something that can kill you from 40, 50 feet away. And we see a lot of the time in that movie, it's a strike with those little pumpkin looking bomb things, and it's terrifying. I think the actual mask itself is just genuinely scary, and I think for an effective villain, you need to be able to make him scary. And I think Sam Raimi, he's a horror director, he knows how to evoke fear, and I think that was really what drew me to that character in the beginning, and what still draws me into the Green Goblin, because you have that relationship with Peter as Norman Osborn that is threatening. You know, that Thanksgiving scene where he sees Peter scrape and he says, "What is that?" And Peter goes, "Bike accident." And it's like there's that tension, and that unspoken tension. And then the next scene is where Aunt May gets attacked in her home by the Green Goblin, and it's like it's the real life implications then translating to the superhero implications, and it's the two lives crossing over, because, you know, he is both this Green Goblin and this Norman Osborn person.
Totally, which is very ubiquitous now. You know what I mean? I
Mhm.
feel like in every superhero movie, there's almost a requisite conversation about
Right.
how having these powers affects your life. You know what I mean? Like,
Mhm.
there's always a scene with a father figure, a mother figure. You know what I mean? Where it's like, I didn't know that all these would this and that. But to get back to the villain, yes, agreed on Green Goblin. I think that's a really good point. I think that seeing that power in a very raw way makes you reckon with this villain and sort of give them the props they deserve. Last word on Brian Cox. I think a thing he does that's very valuable is that he underplays the character. And I think that it's a very good choice because the character does not have a mutation and does not have powers. So
True.
you watch this guy fighting with these great warriors, all of whom have powers, etc., etc. He doesn't have powers, but he's pretty much always calm. And he seems to know what's going on more than the other characters. And
Mhm.
I would say that is how they turn Stryker into a really effective villain in X-Men. He
Yeah.
knows a little more than everyone else.
I think it's very interesting. These are not opposites because they are both very, brilliant minds using this mostly to their advantage. But I think
True.
the
Yeah.
reason why I'd campaign a little bit more for the Green Goblin is because he has that extra layer of the suit, of the armor, of the different gadgets that can
Mm-hmm.
attack that I think make him a little bit more effective, I'd say. But again, like if you want to go to the coin flip, we can go to the
No,
coin flip.
I think I got to agree with you on that one because while Stryker is scary, the things that make Stryker scary are the things that he delegates. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? He has his son who can kind of shut down Professor X. He has all these soldiers who can do this and that. He has all this intel that all the
Right.
other characters want to know, and he's
Right.
not sharing it with anyone. But
Mm.
when Stryker gets stabbed and chained up at the end, you're not scared of him anymore. You're pretty sure he's going to die. And then he
Yeah.
does.
hmm And that's the thing where Green Goblin, it's like the only way he dies is just because Spider-Man jumps above the glider. Like the glider kills him,
Exactly.
but again, that is just because of his own doing rather than anyone else's doing. Like the only way to stop
Good
Green
point.
Goblin was for him to stop himself, essentially. And I think that only goes more to his power. So I think I'm getting the first point here. Is that
Yeah, I think you get this one.
Woohoo!
Agreed.
All right, I'm making a
Ding, ding, ding,
comeback
ding.
already. 1-0. All right, so we're moving on to the next part, which is going to be, I think, a much harder battle because these are two very good
Agreed.
action-heavy superhero movies. So Crosby, tell me about X2, all the
Okay.
fights or a specific fight,
This
whatever.
this film, I think, more than any other film I can think of, sort of changed the superhero fight idea because in
hmm
X1 they explore the fights that now feel, like I've said before, kind of ubiquitous in films, where it's like, regardless of how the powers work out, it's going to be a close to medium range fight. There's going to be punching, there's going to be physical attacks. Even if it's magic, it's going to be used in like a physical way. That is something that happens in X2 that I think all of these superhero films of now kind of replicate and almost owe to it.
Yeah.
Specifically, I have to shout out Rebecca Romijn, I believe is her name. She plays Mystique, and
Hmm.
she has to do these fights that are by far the most complex in the film, by far. And she has to do them in a suit covering her entire skin. The thought I had when I rewatched this was just the amount of limited visibility she would have while in that suit, wearing colored contacts. It's incredible that she's really one of the first, really the first character I think of when I was a young person. I was like, okay, just like badasses, just like who's like the biggest badass in film. And if you asked like 9-year-old Krosby, that would be like Mystique, definitely. And while I enjoyed the Jennifer Lawrence Mystique of the newer movies, there was something really powerful and dangerous about the character who never talks.
hmm
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And Mystique never talks in the older X-Men movies. But
hmm
what are your thoughts, my friend? Tell me about your
Yeah.
fights in Spider-Man.
I mean, what's interesting about Spider-Man is that it's set in New York City, so obviously there's that like almost familiarity with the area, and they really
Mm-hmm.
use the area effectively. I think a lot of the stuff is shot on location, and if there is some fighting, it is done in green
Yes.
screen, but enough of it I think is set on practical location, which I think really, really helps the film. It doesn't help the point, obviously, with the green screen stuff, but like, but I do think it's really interesting how they use the city effectively and how they make the city almost like a jungle gym and like a playground, to where even if the action itself isn't anything too complex, it's not like, the second film has that great train sequence. But I think
Yeah.
the first film, it doesn't have any sort of set piece that's like, that's an amazing set piece of action. Like there's the scene where Green Goblin, and there's that the car that's like you know what I'm saying? The
I think I
not a
do.
car,
Yeah.
it's like almost like a trolley or whatever, and it's like hanging over the ocean. It's about to
It's the
fall or
it's the
whatever,
like
and then
kids versus
the cable car.
humanity,
That's what
right?
it is. It's yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the kids, and then the Mary Jane, and it's that fight. Like
Yeah.
that's the big set piece, but it's not like anything as memorable as some of the other set pieces. But
Sure.
I think there's something about just every scene having its own sense of like fun and
Mm.
again, like it's that city is a jungle gym
Yeah, it has
idea
like a
where
place, like
right,
it has a sense of place.
right, it has a sense of groundedness and place and familiarity that I really enjoy with that movie. And again, with the web powers, it's really fun to see just all the different things they do with the action in terms of the webs, using them throughout the film. Also, as a parallel to Peter growing up and learning about himself, learning how Spider-Man uses his powers too. It's great to see the evolution of the fights over the
Yeah.
course of the film.
Yeah.
How Peter starts in this in this ring with Bonesaw in the wrestling match, and then how he grows all the way to the very end when he's facing off against the Green Goblin. So I think there's almost something I think more impressive with the actual thematic nature and the familiarity and the
Mm-hmm.
groundedness of the fights that aren't necessarily, you know, because of the fights themselves and the actual action choreography, but
Mm-hmm.
more of just the thematic resonance. If that makes
Definitely, like
sense.
the almost the importance of the fight in that place in the story at that time in the
Right.
story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Totally.
and again, back to what I was saying with the Green Goblin, you have those cool gadgets also, which ups the horror, because I think Sam Raimi is a horror director first and foremost, and he really
Yeah.
allows some of those fights to lean into that horror. But I do think also one of the interesting things about X2 is that you have a whole team. So it's not just what can this one person do with all his webs, it's what
Right.
can each of these individuals do with their own powers. And I think that is almost harder to pull off because you don't just have a 1v1 fight. You have all these different
Right.
elements, all these people to figure out. You have to have everyone on the same page. You have to have everything lined up at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
same place, same page, which I think makes that action a little more hard to pull off and a little bit more impressive, I think.
And I will say, I think that is something that has heavily influenced superhero movies of today, because
Mm-hmm.
there is always, okay, how are we going to show off this power in this fight? How are we going to show off this power in this part of the fight? And how are we going to show off these two powers working in conjunction?
Mm-hmm.
Like when you watch X2, you have this whole square off feel to like the whole film, where it's just like, all right, square up. There's just going to be a fight every 20 minutes. There's going to be a fight. There are going to be two sides. They're going to be relatively evenly matched. That is superhero movies now. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's what it is. There will always be one team squaring off against another team,
Yeah, and I think honestly, X2 and X-Men in general set the stage for what the Avengers would later become.
I
Because
agree.
I don't think you can even think about doing a team up movie without X-Men and then of course the Incredibles showing like what it means
Yeah.
to have this camaraderie group like sense. And I think
Totally.
a lot of people are like, "Oh my god, Avengers, how'd they pull off putting all of them together?" And I'm like, they weren't the first ones to do it,
Yeah, no, it's a
X-Men
good point.
X-Men is really the first time you see all these different people with different powers coming together and using their powers collectively, and I think that's really what makes it super interesting.
Super.
So I'm willing to give you the point here, Crosby. I think
I'll
you sold
take
me
the
on it.
point.
Boom, boom, 1-1. So yeah, the fights in X-Men are great. The fights in Spider-Man are great, but I think
Also
yours
great.
are
Yeah.
more complex, and I think there's a lot more weight to those fights because I think my fights were a little bit more expanded upon in future movies and improved upon.
True.
Whereas, yeah, it's about the other stuff in Spider-Man, not just the fights. That was the reason I love it, which is why when we get into future categories, I might have an upper hand, but we'll see. Elite Editing Award. So, Crosby, remind us one more time what this entails.
Okay, so basically the idea behind this is it's the visual effects award overall.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes into account film editing and special effects editing, but it also takes into account costuming, props, makeup.
Cool.
And the reason I bring up makeup is because the makeup of X2 is fantastic. They sort of expand upon the Mystique look that they were doing in the first movie, where they're like, okay, no, we're going to lean into it. We're going to make it her look, and we're going to keep it consistent. Then with also just great that Alan Cummings in this movie as Nightcrawler. One movie, never seen again. But the Nightcrawler makeup is fantastic. You can tell that this is state of the art for 2003, and that also feels very modern day, in that it's sort of like, if you're making a superhero movie, it has to be at this certain level of visual effects. Otherwise, the audience literally it's not going to hold their attention. They're not going to be able to deal with just the story given what they were expecting going into the film. Now, because of films like X2 and the Avengers and Spider-Man that have set up an idea of how a superhero movie works and what it looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's interesting about Spider-Man is that, like, again, you don't have to make, like, creatures, because the Green Goblin is not a creature, it's a suit. But I think in that suit, it gives it such an authentic feel. And like I was saying earlier with this whole city idea, how all the action being set in the city makes it feel more grounded and relatable. I think having the suits actually be something that a human can actually make, and they show Peter designing the suit and making the suit.
Right, yeah.
I think so when you fully see all these costumes come to life, it's almost like you can see yourself in the heroes. It's not like, no offense, but it's not like Mystique, where it's like, no one could just become Mystique, or Beast or anything like that. It's like, no, you have, these are just normal people. I mean, obviously they are enhanced with their, his spider bite, but anyone can wear the suit, and they kind of go into that in Spider-Verse with the Stan Lee moment. Anyone can wear the suit, anyone can wear the mask. In terms of all the visual effects too, like both these movies early 2000s, so they're still kind of getting their groove.
They feel like early 2000s.
Yeah, I think the effects themselves are a little dated, but I think because a lot of my movie is set again in New York, there's less to hide. There's less to hide, so it's less of making fake sets, and it's just like, okay, let's put the spider web there, and the webs themselves look cool. Like the design of the webs, I don't know how much is practical, how much is special effects, but the webs themselves look pretty cool. I've always loved like the tangibility of the webs, like especially in the cafeteria scene. I love the the idea of the web being like this gooey, icky thing. Like I like how it has like almost its own character.
It's a tactile like idea,
exactly. Yeah. So those are the effects in Spider-Man that I really, really like.
I think I have to agree with you. I think I have to give this one to Spider-Man, just because of the fact, like, it does do this. I love the X-Men movies, but it does do this thing where it's like, okay, how many underground bases can we send the X-Men through? You know what I mean? And I do feel like a part of that is because of the limitations of the technology. You know what I mean? It was like, well, what can we light? Like, what can we design and then destroy believably with our actors around it? They don't need to do that today. You know what I mean? Now they can just have, Josh Brolin and Robert Downey Jr. in front of a big green curtain, and it's fine. They have dots on their faces, and it looks fantastic. But I think one of the things that's cool about the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies is that there is a feel to them that is very genuine. You know what I mean? That is very like a real world superhero feel. Almost like it's a completely different feel, but almost like Kick-Ass in a way, where it's like this film is aggressively grounded in the real world. And maybe that's just a consequence of doing it in like New York, but like Avengers takes place in New York. And I would argue that the New York of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man, even though it's earlier on, feels more New Yorky than the city that gets destroyed in the Avengers, regardless of how
because it's the actual city. You're filming in the city, and I get some of the MCU movies might have elements filmed in the city, but it's all glossed over with that like visual effects stuff. And I think for the Elite Editing Award, is it better to award a film that has more visible effects that don't hold up as well, or the effects that are so well done that it's almost like you don't notice the effect? And I think in that case, Spider-Man does work, because you have these effects that are so subtle that like they do enough to make the movie work, but you have enough that is shot on location, enough that is practical. The costumes themselves feel, again, like the tangibility that makes
Exactly.
it still timeless, and it does keep it from being dated.
Yeah, from
Opposed
getting
to some
stale.
MCU
Yeah.
films, some other films in the superhero genre, for sure.
No,
Yep.
it's true.
All right. So we're gonna move on now. Speaking of
Alrighty.
genuine, genuine directing points. Now this is not just for the director
No,
themselves.
no, it's
Obviously,
just a
it's the overall,
sort of
how
quality, you
yeah,
know.
how it holds up as a movie as opposed to just a superhero movie, how it is as a movie itself. Because if we're talking director specifically, Bryan Singer has gotten himself in a lot of trouble
Oh yeah.
with some
Oh
really
yeah.
terrible stuff. So I think comparing the directors themselves would not be a fair
Yeah, and I mean, it's,
assessment.
it's not comparing the directors, it's people, it's comparing their
Right,
styles.
but
I
even
think,
then there's that little bit of bias too. So
yeah,
yeah, we're gonna.
exactly. I think if you're just looking at style as a thing, um, I think that Bryan Singer's directing is solid for this movie, but it's not really creative. And it
Mhm.
kills me because I think it's a good movie. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I don't think that he screwed up in making it or like et cetera, et cetera. But I do think that he had the freedom after the success of the first X-Men film to really do something different.
Mhm.
So if we're just talking the directorial style, which obviously we're not, then I would agree that Rami, especially with his horror chops, like you're saying, and I think it's a really interesting point that people don't bring up, but I think with his horror chops, he brings something to a superhero film that you're not really expecting.
hmm And his a lot of his horror is grounded also in camp horror too. So you also
Good
get that
point.
campiness too. That it's like even if these aren't horror elements, like the moments of him learning how to climb and him in his room trying to discover what's
Yeah,
going on with his
yeah,
webs, that all is not horror, but there's that campiness that you see in like Evil Dead that Sam Raimi also did. Like
totally. Yeah,
you see that campiness in it, and I that's kind of why I like the Spider-Man a lot. Like I said earlier, the action is not what stands out for me. It is the character moments, it's the campiness, it's the high school nature. And a lot of
yeah.
people say Tobey Maguire, feels too old. You know, at that time though, there was no precedent for how these movies should be cast.
True.
He was
No,
a
it's
bigger
true.
star. He
Yeah.
was coming off of some buzz for some Oscar-y movies like The Cider
Oh
House
yeah.
Rules, I think is the name of it. And
Yeah. Exactly.
he did a good job. I thought. I get the criticisms. I get he's not age appropriate like Tom Holland is now, obviously, but
Right. Yeah.
there's something about the almost awkwardness of Tobey Maguire that works so well for Peter. Because in the MCU, it's like he's a little bit more of like a wise cracking, like
Yeah. Exactly. He's like
mouthy
a
teenager.
yeah. Exactly. And
Yeah, but this is like the almost awkward, quiet introvert teenager, which I think works because then when you see him as Spider-Man, all that washes away, and I think it's a really
right.
great
Yeah.
dichotomy. Hmm
It's a freedom. I totally yeah. I think the thing that's interesting, is like I don't think you can single Toby Maguire out, in my opinion, like as like a well, this guy's way too old for the part. It's like, okay, he's too old for the part. So is everyone who's ever played a child in a film
Right.
ever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I hate to break it to you, but all 12-year-olds in film are actually 17. And
Right.
all people you think are 7 in films are actually like 10. So
Yeah.
it's not like that's to me at least, like, and I agree that people do kind of rip it for that. I don't think that's something that is that much of a knock on the film. I
hmm
will say I think that X-Men did really good things with their casting. I think that
Definitely.
they sort of said, okay, we're not going to go too far into the mainstream. It's gonna be star-studded. We're gonna have Halle Berry, but it's gonna be a bit more honestly, it's very heavily like theater leaning as a group of
Yeah.
actors. You have specifically X2. You have obviously Sir Ian McKellen, Sir Patrick Stewart. Then you have Hugh Jackman, who's always a very successful stage performer. You have Alan Cumming, who's primarily known as a stage performer. And I can guarantee you that if you went into the backgrounds of a lot of the other actors, they probably have theater backgrounds too. But specifically the stars being that, I think it does give the movie a certain character, a certain
Yeah.
through line that I think superhero movies sometimes undervalue.
Yeah. And yeah, I think because we've seen like a lot of the Marvel movies are like superhero comedies, and then there's like
Yeah,
superhero
exactly.
horror, or there's superhero Civil War and Winter Soldier, like superhero spy noir
Yeah,
type of things.
spy noir, or just
Whereas
like, square off the board, whatever. Yeah,
both of these movies are just fantasy. They're
yeah,
fantasy movies because at
yeah.
the time there was no subgenres of superhero movies. It was
That's a good
what is a
point.
superhero movie? It's fantasy, and that's why having like you said that like almost theatricalness of
Yeah,
the cast, the colorful ensemble of characters, it really helps deliver this fantasy element because we're getting closer to like setting the superheroes more into reality, but it's still fantasy at this point. And all superhero movies are fantasy, but you don't have like the Captain Americas where it's like, oh, this is a war film, like Wonder Woman, it's a war
right,
film. No, you don't
right,
have that.
totally. Yeah,
And I think obviously we got there with like Logan being a Western, but I don't
yeah,
think earlier
totally.
on these were both fantasy films. So it makes sense to cast people who really can deliver almost a Shakespearean-ness, not to the extent of like a
Agreed. No,
Thor.
but
Yeah.
definitely almost like a classical tone to the
Hmm.
narrative. And I think you bring up a really good point, which is that I mean it's basically the reason we're talking about them. But this is before superhero films as we know it. They're just another part of pop culture. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? Like this is like the year after or like the year before Return of the King comes out.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like this is still the country is still in the throes of Lord of the Rings. You know what I mean? Like I adore both of these films, but I don't think that either one of them is as good as Lord of the Rings.
No.
Like we had different priorities, I think, as a pop culture at this point, but
Hmm.
I think that allowed for some movies to be a little bit more interesting than they might be now with a more direct idea of what their genre is and of the beats that
Hmm.
they have to hit and of the points they have to have, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, I will say Spider-Man also has this idea of being a coming of age film too. If we're gonna,
True.
take away the fantasy elements, it's a really solid coming of age film too for Peter, but also in terms of his romance with Mary Jane and the
Yeah.
idea. I mean, that kiss scene is so
Oh,
iconic. It is the most
it's
iconic movie kiss for a reason.
maybe, yeah, probably ever. Probably ever.
I would say so. I mean, there are
Yeah.
only a few that I can think of off the top of my mind, like maybe the Titanic one that like comes close, I
Yeah,
guess.
maybe, but like every
Yeah.
movie, like the thing about like that movie, that kiss has a similar impact to like, like moments in Pulp Fiction. You know what I mean? Like they
Hmm.
just stick in the craw of pop culture. Like we're
In a
never gonna
hundred
move
years,
on from the upside down kiss. You know what I mean?
exactly. In
Like
in 100 years, that will be talked about still. You know,
exactly, yeah.
and I think that's kind of where I'm leaning. Where I'm basing my argument is that
Yeah.
like there are so many other elements to the movie aside from the actions, aside from the villain, aside from all the visual effects, aside from the set pieces and all that, where it's just these characters living. It's this kid
Yeah.
losing his uncle early on. I mean, that
True.
trope has been done to death now, but before that, obviously, Superman is the first to do it,
Sure,
but
sure. But
that whole
still.
that whole scene, it. I remember watching it, and that was, I think, aside from Lion King, the first time I had a parent explain to me what death was when watching a
Wow.
movie was with Spider-Man, and I think it's because of those other moments that make Spider-Man so good for me, that excel beyond all the glitz and glam and all that stuff.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Oh man, uh, I think I have to give this one to you because I just thought of another
Wow.
thing that bothers me. You know what
Okay.
bothers me is that they don't do as much with the X Mansion in this film as they should. As
Hmm.
much as as many problems as there were with the third X-Men movie in the franchise, which is a bananas movie. It is all over the place, but
I
it's
don't
very
hate it
fun.
though. Yeah, it's fun.
The one thing that I will say that I think they nailed in that movie was they were like, okay, we have the X Mansion. Let's just be at the school for the gifted for a little while and like have some fun and like
Hmm.
look around and see what's going on. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's the thing I don't like about this movie is that I don't think it actually explores interesting places enough. I think it does okay, we are at the X Mansion for a second, and then now we're going to find these people. And then it's like, well, that mansion's under attack. And it's like, well, we can't go back there. Now we're going to go to a facility, And it's like not using the Batcave. You know, it's like,
Yeah.
come on.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of why I didn't go with Spider-Man 2, because part of it is like the second one, it's already, we've already established Peter and Mary Jane's relationship
Totally.
to an extent where it's like there's something about the first film where we really dig into that relationship. The second one with Harry, it's all about Harry figuring out who killed his dad, and then
Right.
obviously you find out it's Peter. But I think there's something nice about the first one where Harry doesn't know a thing, and Harry idolizes his dad, but also hates his dad to an extent. Like
Totally.
there's that dynamic, and then with Peter and Harry, I think there's stuff that the first one has so much rich stuff in it that the second one, because it's a sequel, doesn't need to
It
necessarily
just
dive
doesn't
into.
need. It doesn't need to happen.
Right. And that might honestly be the issue in this respective
I would
rubric
agree
point
with X2.
with
Yeah.
X2 is that it's already set up a lot of that in the first one. So as a nature of being a sequel, they just dive right into the action
Because they
and,
don't have to teach you about the X Mansion. They
Right.
don't have to.
And-
They
and there's
assume you've
nothing
seen
wrong
them.
with that, but as separating it as its own movie and like watching
Right.
it as a movie, it's harder when not in the context of the other two, because it's the
Yeah.
middle piece of a trilogy. Whereas mine, it's like you can watch it when it ends, you can watch the next one, or you can not. It doesn't matter.
It's
You
true.
still got your own full story. It feels like watching
Yeah.
it. So, am I getting this
I
point?
think you take this one, Bill. I think you take it.
So that's a win for me.
Oh,
Wow.
man.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm so sorry to do it, but we do have
my
one more
chest.
category. You can still win us on this one, and try to win me over all you can.
Okay.
Netflix and Chex Mix, which is hard for us obviously because this is where kind of the nostalgia comes in and how much we
It's true.
personally want to rewatch it. It's hard to judge.
True. I think the thing that X2 brings is that, and after I talk this way about how it didn't do as much as it should have or this and that, it is really unique. Even today, the movies that we make are not like X2, because X2 was between, when you see the man evolving and there's like the chimp at the beginning and then there's the upright man with a tie on at the end. Like,
yeah.
X2 is very much in the middle. Like, X2 is still writing rules for how to do a superhero movie. Like, in X2, it's like, wait, can superheroes cheat on each other? Like, is that something we can explore? You know what I mean? Like, I think it's funny because I think there are all these questions that we sort of now take for granted, where it's like, oh, yeah, well, like Tony Stark, he's a playboy, but he's found his love, so now he's trying to figure everything out. He's trying to be a responsible dad, But I don't think we really made those type of assumptions about heroes before the X-Men franchise. And I think a part of it is because the film X-Men franchise was so obviously an allegory for the gay rights movement at the time in the United States. Very obviously. Which is, I think, part of the reason why it's still powerful. But I think almost due to the fact that it is so heavily of its time and making arguments that are very much of their time, while I love it and while it is crazy unique, I didn't actually get as much from watching it today as I think I did when I was a kid.
Okay, yeah, and that's fine. And that's what
much as I love
the superhero genre, the abundance of superhero movies that have come out since, will obviously have an impact on how we revisit things and how the scale of these movies holds up. I think the first X-Men definitely really suffers from that. I think the scale itself. The X2, I think, is an improvement on the first one and the best in that trilogy. In fact, the best of all the pre-MCU X-Men movies for sure.
I think so.
Thing about Spider-Man, like I said, the action gets better as the series goes on.
True.
This is not a movie you watch for the action. The action is great, but it's not. You watch it for those character moments, to where I would probably be more inclined to rewatch some of the other movies for those moments as a popcorn
action
flick. Like, I want to watch that Doc Ock train scene over any scene in any superhero movie ever.
Forever and ever.
But as a whole movie, if I just want to sit down and really take in a good coming of age story, I'm going to watch the first Spider-Man. And again, it's that idea of childhood and nostalgia, because I know we tried to say earlier, we're taking it out of it, but for both of us, we did pick something that was so nostalgic, and Incredibles was my backups for the same reason. It's because there's something about watching these movies so young and having that wide-eyed, endless realm of possibility when you watch those movies. It's the whole, with great honor comes great responsibility. There's so many of those really nice themes that are just woven throughout. And the action is fun. I really think it's got the whole package of what an origin story should be. I think now now that we've gotten so many origin stories, I'm less inclined to revisit it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we've seen the origin story beaten to death
A
with so many other
times.
films. That you really, in order to make an origin story new and innovative, you really have to go for it. And I think Spider-Verse did a really good job of that.
100%. That's an excellent film.
So you know, but like we both said earlier, or what you said at the very beginning, is that these were trendsetters for the genre itself. So I don't think you can blame some of these films for feeling a little bit, you know,
I agree.
tropey,
Yeah.
because the tropes didn't exist yet.
And
you
that's the tough thing about this category, isn't it? It's like, okay, the Netflix and checks make scale for this film. So Netflix and checks make scale for superhero movies before they really figured out what they were. You know what I mean? Before...
Yeah, I think we have to judge it pre-MCU, because now with the MCU, obviously we're going to go for the more big spectacle, you know, non-origin story. You know, these are movies that are still trying to find their groove. But I think pre-MCU, you know, these two movies are endlessly rewatchable.
Agreed.
So I don't really know how to give the point.
I think we got a coin flip on this one.
Oh boy. So I could walk away with a 4-1 victory.
You can walk away with a 4-1 right now. You
close the gap. All right. I'm heads, your tails, as always, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Siri, flip a coin, please. I'm walking away with that 4-1. I'm sorry, Krosby. So that is the sweep. So, Krosby, I do feel for you because I love X2. But I think just with this rubric, the way it panned out, that's how it went.
You know, but and also, you know, the point of this podcast and the reason I love it is the point is to bring something and then together objectively look at them and say, well, what does yours bring versus what does mine bring? And I love it. I think it's great.
And a lot of the time I'll sway you, you'll sway me. And that's true. The beauty of it is because we want to push our own films up. We don't want to take each other's down. Exactly. And that would be, you know, not as fun.
Exactly. Who needs it?
Right. So let's just to recap. What is the best pre-MCU not Marvel, but in this case it is Marvel, but superhero movie? The one scale of effective villainy. Between what's his name?
Between
Stryker.
Willem Dafoe, Green Goblin, of course.
Yes. What is yours name?
And Brian Cox is Stryker.
Stryker, right. Yes. So between Green Goblin and Stryker, Green Goblin got the point there. The Green Screen Fight Club, X2, took the award for fighting. For Elite Editing Award, we went with quality over quantity, and we went with Spider-Man. For the GDP, genuine directing points, we determined that Spider-Man was probably a better movie as a movie rather than a superhero movie. And then the Netflix and checks mix scale, Spider-Man, according to Siri, is the most rewatchable.
Siri is a big old Spider-Man fan. You heard it here first.
Right. So I come away with this victory 4-1, but I think next week is gonna be real interesting. Or in 2 weeks. Cool. Yeah, because we do the show the first and third Friday of every month. Exactly. So the next show will be coming to you in 2 weeks' time, which I believe is April 16th. Yes, April 16th, which is the morning before I get my second vaccine and the day before my birthday.
Hey, so look at that.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting weekend. But there's something even more exciting happening the week after, and that is the Oscars. So we decided for our next show, instead of doing the typical, you know, we pick one question and we have 5 different bullet points that we fight it out and then we crown one winner, we are going to do 5 mini fights.
Yes,
indeed. And we are going to be doing 5 film offs. And the topic, the question is, what are the greatest Oscar snubs? Of all time. Meaning movies that didn't even get nominated, performances that didn't even get nominated. So we're not talking like Saving Private Ryan losing the Shakespeare in Love. Saving Private Ryan was nominated, so it was awarded some sort of. It wasn't awarded the gold for Best Picture, but it was in the conversation.
Exactly, it got the nod. So we're looking at things that didn't even get the nod. So what we will be doing, instead of picking one movie and doing 5 different rubrics and determining one winner, we're doing 5 mini fights. So we will be doing what is the greatest supporting actor snub, what is the greatest supporting actress snub, what is the greatest best actor snub, what is the greatest best actress snub, and what is the greatest best picture snub. We'll be doing 5 fights, no rubric. It'll just be whoever wins each fight wins each fight. Exactly.
And we could see someone win 5 total film-offs in one episode, which is going to be crazy. Because right now I have 2 wins. Krosby has 1 win, but he could come away next week with 6 whole wins under his belt.
We'll
so
see.
It's going to be our Oscar roulette, our Oscar circuit. We are going to be,
indeed.
yeah. Because I do a show on my channel where I break down Oscar nominees from that year, but we don't talk a lot about the snubs. We don't discuss the ones that should have been nominated in the first place. There's a recent acting nominee that I still can't get over that didn't get nominated from just last year, and I wonder if we'll be talking about the same person. Who knows? But that is going to be our next show, so I'm very, very excited. Krosby, real quick, tell everyone where they can find you over on Twitch.
Well, you can find me at Rice Krosby Treats on twitch.tv. And where can we find you, Dill?
You can find me here on the Dill Pickle Movie Network if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on podcast, thank you so much. You can find us, of course, on Spotify, Apple Music, Google Podcasts, wherever you want to listen to podcasts. We'll likely be there. If we're not there, let us know. Reach out to us and tell us where you might find us. Krosby, I forgot one last very important thing, and that is to read all the answers from our good friends who submitted answers to this poll, because that is our favorite thing to do, and I almost forgot it. I'm glad I did.
It is our favorite thing to do. Let's hear it.
I posed the question on my Instagram poll: what is the best pre-MCU superhero movie? Now, here's the thing, guys. If you want to be read out loud on this show, you can just go to @Dylan_Randazzo64, and you can follow me. And you can even follow Krosby at his Instagram. We will link it too. And you can fill out your own answer, and we will read it here on the show. It's all it takes is for you to click on the little poll and type it in. So
type in your answer.
So we did get 8 responses. So thank you for the 8 people who submitted.
Love to
still not as big as our first showing, but hopefully for the next one, I will be posting 5 mini polls. So there'll be 5 whole polls. So Dean, starting off with Dean. Dean says Sam Raimi's Spider-Man Trilogy. So it's the whole 3 movies. Kelsey says The Incredibles, which is
what a good choice. Such a good choice.
A solid choice. Ben says Spider-Man 2. Again, another one. Sammy says Blade, which is one I haven't seen. I talked to Krosby a little bit about it earlier. Yeah,
that's a cool answer to give if you're like at a party or something. Like that's an original one.
Speed Queen also said Blade. Crazy enough. Nick Moore said X2, so he's with you.
See, Nick gets it.
Yeah. SC Clark says Incredibles manages to both pay homage to and subvert the whole genre in a clever way. Awesome response.
True.
And
a true statement.
Lastly, we have our good friend Victor. He said it's a tie between Spider-Man 2 and The Dark Knight. The thing is, we did think about The Dark Knight, but then we realized that Iron Man came out before The Dark Knight, so technically it's not pre-MCU, so we didn't include it. But of course, Victor, we love your choice.
We do.
We decided to read it.
And before we go, I do think it is important to say, like you said, we had to say, wait a minute, the first question we had is The Dark Knight before or after the start of the MCU?
I think there's a very obvious choice. There's a reason I have a cape here, and a reason I have a Batman book, and the reason I have little Batman right there. It's because I've got my night shift in about an hour. I gotta go do my Batman shift. Actually, you're listening to it in the morning. Never mind.
He's already done
12 hours. I've already done my Batman shift. But it is probably the best superhero movie. One of them of all time. So
arguably the best action movie of all time. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible. That's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, and you know what? There may be it may be brought up next show. Who knows? Until next time, it has been an honor talking with you, Krosby. It's always a fun time. Always a
privilege, Dylan, as always.
Yeah, so we will be talking to you in 2 weeks about all Oscar snubs. So best supporting actor, supporting actress, actor, actress, and picture. Start thinking about them now, because that poll will be going on in about a week, and you guys can get on Instagram and literally submit your answers, and we will read them here on the air.
Get on, everyone, you know you want to.
Yeah, you know you want to. This has been a film off. I'm so honored to take away the victory for Spider-Man and for Sam Raimi and for my man Tobey Maguire. Tobes, we love you. Everyone, stay safe. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.